The final school bell was the best sound of her day. It wasn't just the signal that math class was over, but the starting pistol for a quiet, secret journey. For a 12-year-old girl whose world was the size of a postage stamp, the journey was everything. She would sling her worn backpack heavy with books, but light on personal belongings, over one shoulder and join the river of students flowing out the main doors. But while the river flowed towards home, playgrounds, and corner stores, she was a small current that broke away, heading for the city bus stop 3 blocks down. She was a girl of few words, a quiet observer who had learned early on that being invisible was a superpower. It allowed her to notice things. She noticed the way the bus driver's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, the way a stray cat in the alley near her stop always tilted its head at the same angle, the way the light hit the dusty windows of the corner bodega just before sunset. These small details were the threads she used to weave the fabric of her days. Her destination was a world away from the cracked sidewalks and graffiti-covered storefronts of her neighborhood. The bus ride was a slow transition, each stop peeling away a layer of her own reality and replacing it with another. The noisy chatter of other kids gave way to the tired silence of working adults. The smell of street food and exhaust fumes was slowly replaced by the scent of cut grass and expensive car leather. By the time she got off at her stop, a shaded bench under a large oak tree, she was in a different country. The house was less a house and more a landmass. It sat behind modern gates that were always open in the afternoon, a silent invitation to a world she wasn't sure she was allowed to enter. She walked up the long, winding driveway, her sneakers making no sound on the smooth gray cobblestones. The lawns were impossibly green, manicured with the precision of a surgeon. Flowers she only knew from bookstaloops, hydrangeas, roses bloomed in organized riots of color. It was beautiful, but it was a cold kind of beauty. Like a painting in a museum you're not allowed to touch, she would let herself in the side door, which was always unlocked, and step into the cool, dim silence of the mudroom. Here the air smelled of lemon polish and damp stone. She'd leave her backpack by a row of boots that cost more than her mother's monthly salary and slip into the main part of the house. This was her territory, her silent kingdom. For 2 hours every weekday, this vast, empty space belonged to her. Her mother was here somewhere, a ghost moving through the rooms, her work a quiet, constant hum. The girl knew her mother's schedule by heart. From 2 to 3, she was dusting the library on the second floor. From 3 to 4, she was polishing the silver in the butler's pantry. The girl never sought her out. It was an unspoken rule between them. The girl was a guest, and her mother was the help. To blur those lines, even for a moment, felt like a dangerous thing, so she would wander. She would trace the intricate patterns of the Persian rugs with her eyes, run her fingers along the spines of books in the library she would never be able to read, and press her nose against the glass of the display cabinets, looking at delicate china dolls with frozen porcelain smiles. But her journey always ended in the same place, the formal living room. And in that room, there was the piano. It was a grand piano, black and gleaming, so large it seemed to have its own gravitational pull. It sat in the center of the room, angled towards a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out onto a perfectly manicured garden. The sunlight would stream in, illuminating the dust motes dancing around it, making it look like it was floating. To the girl, it wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was a sleeping beast, a silent giant holding 1,000 stories inside its polished wooden belly. The white keys looked like long, perfect teeth, and the black keys were shadows in between. She never touched it. She was afraid that if she did, the spell would be broken, or worse. She would leave a smudge, a small, greasy fingerprint that would betray her presence. She would sit on the floor a few feet away, her legs crossed, her back straight, and just look at it. She would imagine what it sounded like. Not the plinking, clumsy notes she heard from other kids' apartments in her building. This piano, she was sure, sounded like thunder and rain, like laughter and tears. It sounded like the way the world felt when you were standing on a mountaintop or the quiet peace of a church. She would close her eyes and try to hear the music in her head, her fingers twitching in her lap, playing silent keys on the air. This was her secret, the first one. The second one was waiting for her at home. Home was a small, two-room apartment on the third floor of a building that always smelled vaguely of boiled cabbage and bleach. The paint on the walls was peeling, the linoleum in the kitchen was cracked, and the window in the main living area looked out directly onto the brick wall of the next building. But it was warm. It was filled with the scent of her mother's cooking, the soft glow of a single lamp in the evening, and the quiet comfort of their shared presence. Her mother would come home hours after she did. Her body slumped with a tiredness so deep it seemed to have its own weight. The girl would see it in the way her mother's shoulders were no longer straight. In the slow, deliberate way, she placed her keys on the small table by the door. Her mother's hands told the story of her day. They were red and raw, the knuckles swollen, the nails short and broken. These were the hands that scrubbed floors, that washed windows, that polished the silver and the wood until it shone. These were the hands that worked so that her daughter could have a life. It was just a little bit easier than her own. They would eat their dinner together, usually a simple soup or beans and rice, and talk about their day. The girl would talk about school, about a funny thing a friend said or a lesson she found interesting. Her mother would listen, nodding, her eyes soft with a love that was too big for their small apartment. She rarely talked about her own day. What was there to say? That she had cleaned a toilet that was bigger than their entire bathroom. That she had dusted picture frames that held photos of people who didn't even know her name. After dinner, her mother would try to read. Her glasses perched on the end of her nose, but more often than not she would fall asleep in her chair, the book open on her lap. The girl would gently take the book, place a blanket over her mother, and then, and only then, would her own day truly begin? She would tiptoe to her corner of the room, separated from the rest of the space by a thin curtain. Her bed was a simple mattress on a metal frame. Underneath it, hidden in a cardboard box that once held cheap shoes, was her treasure. It was a keyboard. It wasn't a grand piano. It was a small, second-hand electronic keyboard. Its plastic casing yellowed with age, some of the letters on the buttons worn away. It had 54 keys, not the 88 of the beast in the mansion. And the sound it made was thin and tinny, a poor imitation of the real thing. But to her, it was magic. She had bought it herself, with months of saved-up allowance. She had skipped the hot lunch at school, choosing a cheese sandwich instead. She had collected empty cans and bottles to turn in for spare change. She had done small chores for an elderly neighbor, carrying her groceries and helping with her laundry. Every penny had gone into a jar, hidden at the back of her closet. It had taken her almost a year, but the day she walked into the pawn shop and counted out the crumpled bills, she felt a sense of accomplishment so powerful it made her hands shake. She would pull the keyboard from its box, the cord trailing behind her like a tail. She would plug it into the wall, slip on the headphones, the most expensive part of the whole setup, and the world would fall away. She taught herself to play. She had found a few old, tattered instruction books at a thrift store, and she would spend hours poring over them, her brow furrowed in concentration. She learned the scales, the chords, the proper way to curve her fingers. At first, her playing was clumsy, a series of disconnected notes that sounded more like mistakes than music. But she was patient. She practiced every single night, her fingers moving slowly and deliberately over the plastic keys. The music was her language. It was the place where she could say all the things she couldn't say out loud. The notes she played were full of the longing she felt when she looked at the grand piano in the mansion. They were filled with the quiet sadness she felt when she saw the exhaustion on her mother's face. They were filled with a hope she couldn't yet name, a feeling that there was something more out there for her. A song she was meant to sing, she would play until her fingers ached and her mother's soft snores from the other room reminded her that it was late. Then she would carefully unplug the keyboard, wrap the cord around it, and slide it back into its box, pushing it deep under the bed. Her secret was safe for another night, lying in the dark. She would close her eyes, and the music would continue to play in her head. But it wasn't the tinny sound of her small keyboard anymore. In her imagination, it was the rich, powerful sound of the grand piano, filling the vast, silent room, echoing off the marble floors and the high ceilings. It was a sound so beautiful it could break your heart. And she dreamed, as she did every night of the day, she would finally be able to play it for real. The routine was a familiar comfort, a well-worn path she walked every weekday. The bus ride, the long walk up the driveway, the quiet entrance through the side door. But today, the silence was different. It wasn't the usual temporary silence of a house holding its breath until its owners returned. This was a deeper, more profound quiet, the silence of an empty nest. The family who lived in the mansion was away on vacation, a fact her mother had mentioned in passing a few days earlier. It changed the entire atmosphere of the place. Without the distant sound of a television or the muffled voices from the upper floors, the house felt like a museum, and she was its only visitor. She found her usual spot in the library, a deep, wing-backed chair that was worn smooth in all the right places. She pulled a book from the shelf, not to read but to hold, its leather cover cool and solid in her hands. From here, she could hear the faint, rhythmic sounds of her mother working, the gentle swish of a duster, the soft clink of a glass being placed on a coaster. These sounds were the heartbeat of her afternoons. But today, even they seemed slower, more deliberate. Time passed, as it always did. The sun began its slow descent, casting long golden rectangles on the Persian rug. The girl expected to hear the familiar sound of her mother's footsteps in the hall, the soft call that it was time to go. But the minutes stretched, and the house remained silent. A knot of unease began to tighten in her stomach. Was her mother okay? Had she hurt herself? She was about to get up to go and find her when she heard a sound. It wasn't the sound of cleaning. It was the sound of footsteps, but they were slow, heavy, as if their owner was carrying a great weight. She appeared in the doorway of the library, and the girl knew immediately that something was wrong. Her mother's face was pale, her eyes holding a distant, unfocused look. She wasn't carrying her cleaning caddy. Her hands, usually so busy, were empty and hanging loosely at her sides. She didn't look at her daughter at first. Her gaze swept across the room, taking in the towering shelves, the dark wood, the leather-bound books, as if seeing it all for the first time. The girl stayed perfectly still, watching her. She had seen her mother tired before, but this was different. This was a deep, soul-weary exhaustion that went beyond a long day's work. It was in the slump of her shoulders and the way her mouth turned down at the corners. It was a look of profound sadness. It's a kind of sadness that has been stored up for a very long time. Finally, her mother's eyes found hers. They held there for a long moment, and in them, the girl saw a confusing mix of emotions. There was the familiar love, the gentle warmth she saw every day. But there was something else too. A flicker of pain, a shadow of a memory, and a strange, hesitant kind of pride. It was a look that asked a question without speaking a single word. Her mother took a step into the room, then another. Her movements were slow, almost graceful, like a sleepwalker. She didn't speak. She just walked towards the door, her eyes still fixed on her daughter, a silent command to follow. The girl's heart began to beat a little faster. This was not part of their routine. This was uncharted territory. She carefully placed the book back on the shelf, her hands trembling slightly, and got up to follow. They walked down the long hallway, their footsteps the only sound in the vast echoing space. Her mother led her not towards the side door in the path home, but deeper into the house, towards the part of the mansion that was always the most silent, the most forbidden. The girl knew where they were going. A cold dread began to creep up her spine. They stopped at the entrance to the formal living room. The setting sun was pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows, bathing the entire room in a warm, ethereal light. And there, in the center of it all, sat the piano. It looked more magnificent than ever, its black surface gleaming like a pool of still water in the golden light. It was the king of its silent kingdom, and for the first time the girl felt not admiration, but fear. Her mother stood beside her, so close that their shoulders were almost touching. She could feel the warmth coming from her mother's body, could smell the faint, clean scent of lemon polish that always clung to her clothes. The silence in the room was thick, heavy with things unsaid. The girl wanted to ask what was wrong, what they were doing here, but the words were stuck in her throat. Then her mother spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, soft and fragile like a moth's wing. "I want you to play the piano for me," she said. The words hung in the air, strange and impossible. Play the piano? Here now. The girl's mind reeled. She must have misheard. This was a test. It had to be a test. She felt a flush of shame, thinking of her small plastic keyboard hidden under her bed. This was a world she didn't belong to, a world of real music and real instruments. And she was just a girl with a secret hobby. She turned to look at her mother, ready to shake her head, to whisper that she couldn't, that she didn't know how. But when she saw her mother's face, the words died on her lips. Her mother wasn't looking at her with expectation or judgment. Her eyes were fixed on the piano, and in their depths, the girl saw a story she had never heard before. It was a story of longing, of a dream so deeply buried it had almost been forgotten. "Just one song," her mother added, her voice still soft, but now with an edge of urgency, of desperation. "Right now." This wasn't a test. This was a plea. The girl looked from her mother's face to the imposing instrument and back again. Her heart was pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her hands felt cold and clammy. Every instinct told her to say no, to turn and run and never look back. But the look in her mother's eyes held her captive. It was a look that bridged the gap between their two worlds, between the maid's daughter and the silent king in the room. It was a look that said, "This is bigger than you. This is bigger than me." Slowly, hesitantly, she nodded. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement, but her mother saw it. A flicker of something relief, gratitude, passed over her face. The girl took a step forward, then another. The short walk across the room felt like the longest journey of her life. The plush rug sank under her sneakers, muffling her footsteps. The air grew cooler as she approached the windows. She could see her own reflection in the polished black surface of the piano. It's a small, scared-looking girl with wide eyes. She reached the bench and stopped. It was a long, polished piece of dark wood, perfectly placed for a pianist. She had never been this close to the piano before. She could smell the faint scent of wood and wax, could see the tiny, almost invisible scratches on the lacquer, marks left by fingers that had played here long ago. She reached out a hand, her fingers trembling, and let them hover over the keys. They were ivory, not plastic, and they had a soft, matte look to them, promising a cool, smooth touch. She could feel her mother's eyes on her back, a steady, silent presence. The whole world seemed to have shrunk to this one room, this one moment. The sun cast long shadows across the floor, and the dust motes danced in the golden light like tiny, silent spectators. She slowly lowered herself onto the bench. It was hard and cold against her legs. She was much closer to the keys now than she was on her small stool at home. The keyboard seemed to stretch out forever, a vast landscape of black and white. Her hands, which felt so small and clumsy, rested in her lap. She thought of the simple melody she had been practicing for weeks on her cheap keyboard, a tune she had pieced together herself from notes she'd heard in her head. It was a simple song, full of a young girl's quiet hopes and fears. It was the only song she truly knew by heart. She took a deep breath, the air catching in her throat. The silence was no longer empty. It was waiting. It was listening. Her mother was waiting. The ghost of whatever memory haunted her mother's eyes was waiting, and the sleeping beast in front of her was waiting to be woken. She lifted her hands, her fingers shaking, and placed them gently on the cool, ivory keys. The touch was electric. A current seemed to run up her arms, and for a second, she felt a connection to the instrument that was both terrifying and exhilarating. She was here. She was about to play, and she had no idea what would happen next. Her fingers rested on the keys, cool and smooth as polished stones. For a moment, she just sat there, her hands frozen, her entire being focused on the point of contact between her skin and the ivory. It was a feeling she had only ever imagined. The keys of her small keyboard at home were made of hard, shiny plastic, but these felt different. They felt alive, as if they held a warmth just beneath the surface, a dormant energy waiting to be released. The air in the room was still, the light from the window growing softer, more golden, as the sun dipped lower in the sky. It felt as though the whole world was holding its breath. Waiting, she could feel her mother's presence behind her, a quiet, steady weight. It wasn't a demanding presence, but a patient one, full of a strange, heavy expectation. The girl's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, a wild, chaotic rhythm that felt completely out of place in the room's deep calm. She thought of her simple melody, the one she had crafted in the quiet of her small room, a tune born from loneliness and a flicker of hope. It felt like a child's drawing now, crude and clumsy thing that had no business being in this grand, beautiful space. But her mother's request echoed in her mind. Just one song. Right now, it wasn't a request. It was a necessity. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she pressed down a key. The sound that filled the room was not the thin, tinny plink she was used to. It was a deep, resonant note that seemed to bloom in the air, a rich, warm sound that vibrated through the key, up her finger and into her very bones. It was a sound with weight, with substance, a sound that seemed to make the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams stop and listen. The girl's eyes widened in shock. It was as if she had spoken a word she didn't know she knew, a word that held the power to change the atmosphere of the entire world. This wasn't just a sound, it was a presence. Hesitantly, she found the next note, and then the next. The beginning of her melody was slow and uncertain, each note a careful, deliberate step. Her fingers, which felt clumsy and large, moved stiffly across the keys. She was so aware of everything, the hard bench beneath her, the vastness of the room, the silence that pressed in from all sides. She was playing, but she wasn't feeling it yet. She was too scared, too self-conscious. She was just a girl pretending to be a pianist, and she was terrified that at any moment, the spell would be broken and everyone would see her for the fraud she was. Then, something shifted as she played the simple phrase for the second time. A muscle memory she didn't know she possessed took over. Her fingers began to relax, to find their natural curve on the keys. The piano seemed to be helping her, guiding her, its responsive action making it easier to express the notes she heard in her head. The sound was so beautiful, so captivating, that it started to pull her in. The fear began to recede, replaced by a growing sense of wonder. She started to forget where she was. The grand room, the mansion, the fact that her mother was watching, it all began to fade into the background. Her world shrank to the 88 black and white keys in front of her. The melody she had written, which had always felt like a secret whispered in a tiny room, was now being sung out loud, and it was more beautiful than she could have ever imagined. The notes flowed from the piano like a river, clear and pure. The low notes rumbled like a gentle thunder, while the high notes sparkled like starlight. She closed her eyes, and the music became her only reality. It was no longer a performance. It was a conversation. She was telling the piano her story. She played the quiet loneliness of her afternoons, the long hours spent waiting in the library, the silent admiration she felt for this very instrument. She played the simple joy of a warm meal shared with her mother, the comfort of their small apartment, the safety of their love. And she played the hope, the deep, unspoken hope, that there was something more for her. A dream she couldn't yet name, but could feel in her heart. A dream that sounded just like this. Her fingers moved with a new confidence, exploring the full range of the keyboard. She was no longer just playing the notes she had memorized. She was improvising, adding small trills and flourishes, letting the music take her where it wanted to go. It was the most free she had ever felt in her entire life. The music swelled, filling the enormous room, spilling out into the hallway and the empty chambers beyond. It was a sound so big and so full of emotion that it seemed to belong to someone else, to a real musician. Not to a 12-year-old girl with a secret hobby, but while the girl was lost in her own world of sound, another world was unraveling behind her. Her mother stood by the large window, her back to the room, her face turned towards the last rays of the setting sun. At first, she had just listened, her body tense, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. But as the melody grew, as the girl's playing became more confident and expressive, something inside her began to crack. A single tear escaped from the corner of her eye, tracing a slow, glistening path down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She just let it fall. Then another came, and another. Soon, silent tears were streaming down her face, her shoulders shaking with a grief so profound it was almost silent. Her work-worn hands, which had spent the day scrubbing and polishing, came up to cover her mouth, as if to stifle a sob that was trying to break free from a place deep inside her. She wasn't just hearing her daughter play. She was hearing a ghost. The melody, though original to the girl, held a structure, a feeling, a soulful longing that was achingly familiar. It was the sound of her own youth, the sound of a dream she had buried so long ago she had forgotten what it felt like. Each note was a memory, a door creaking open in a dusty, abandoned room in her heart. She saw herself as a young girl, with hands just as smooth and uncalloused as her daughter's, sitting in front of a piano just like this one. She felt the same joy, the same sense of rightness, the same feeling of being home when her fingers touched the keys. The music her daughter was creating was not just a song, it was an echo. It was the sound of the life she could have had, the music she was meant to make. She saw the scholarships she had to turn down, the conservatory that remained a distant fantasy, the promise of a future that had dissolved into the harsh reality of poverty and responsibility. She saw all the sacrifices she had made, not with resentment, but with a quiet, enduring love for the child who was now, unknowingly, giving voice to her silenced soul, the girl. Her eyes still closed, reached the climax of her song. The music was passionate and powerful now, a torrent of emotion that filled every corner of the vast, silent house. It was a sound of triumph and heartbreak all at once, a sound that felt too big, too old, to have come from someone so young. She poured everything she had into the final phrases, her fingers flying across the keys, her body swaying with the rhythm. Then, with a final, cascading run of notes, she brought the song to a gentle, peaceful close. She played the last chord and let her hands rest on the keys, allowing the sound to hang in the air for a moment before it slowly faded into a profound and heavy silence. The silence that followed was more powerful than the music had been. It was thick with unspoken words, with the weight of 100 years of memories both lived and lost. The girl took a deep, shuddering breath, the spell finally broken. The world rushed back in the feel of the hard bench, the sight of the dust motes, the golden light of the setting sun. A small, proud smile touched her lips. She had done it. She had played the piano. She turned around on the bench, her heart swelling with a nervous excitement, ready to see her mother's face, to share this incredible moment with her. She expected to see a look of surprise, maybe of pride. She was not prepared for what she saw. Her mother was standing by the window, her back still to her, but her shoulders were shaking. As the girl watched, her mother slowly turned and the girl's smile vanished from her face. Her mother's cheeks were wet with a torrent of tears, her expression a twisted mask of awe, pain, and a love so deep it was heartbreaking. She looked at her daughter not as if she were a child who had just learned a song, but as if she were a ghost from a past she had long since given up for dead. The girl stared, confused and frightened. The beautiful music still echoing in her ears, replaced now by a terrifying and deafening silence. The silence that followed the last fading note was a heavy blanket, smothering the air in the vast room. The girl sat frozen on the piano bench, her hands still resting on the keys, the proud smile that had been forming on her lips now completely gone. In its place was a cold knot of confusion and a dawning sense of fear. She had expected a reaction, but not this. She had never seen her mother cry like this. Not when she was sick, not when money was tight, not when the landlord had been yelling. Her mother was a rock, solid and unyielding. But the woman standing by the window, her face illuminated by the dying light, it looked like she was about to shatter into a million pieces. The girl wanted to get up, to run to her, to ask what was wrong. But her legs felt like they were made of lead, and her feet were glued to the floor. The space between them, only a few feet of polished wood and expensive rug, felt like a vast, uncrossable ocean. She had done this. Her music, her secret happy thing, had caused this pain. A wave of guilt washed over her, so strong it almost made her feel sick. She had broken her mother. Slowly, as if moving through water, her mother turned away from the window. Her eyes were fixed on the piano, not on her daughter. She took a step, then another, her movements slow and deliberate, like someone in a trance. The girl watched, her breath caught in her throat as her mother approached the instrument. She didn't walk around to the bench where the girl was sitting. She stopped at the side, her gaze sweeping over the gleaming black wood, the curved legs. The pedals on the floor. Her mother raised a hand. The hand that was red and raw from a day of harsh chemicals and relentless scrubbing. She held it over the keys, her fingers trembling, not touching them, just hovering a few inches above the ivory. It was as if she was afraid to make contact, as if the piano was a sacred object, and her hand was not worthy. The girl watched her mother's hand, seeing it in a way she never had before. She saw the small scars, the broken nails, the swollen knuckles. They were the hands of a worker, of a fighter. But in that moment, hovering over the piano, they looked like they were remembering something else. "It was just like this," her mother whispered. Her voice was so soft the girl had to strain to hear it. It wasn't a statement directed at anyone. It was a memory spoken aloud. The girl remained silent, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She didn't know what to say, what to do. She was a spectator to a moment she didn't understand. Her mother finally lowered her hand, her index finger gently pressing down on a single key in the middle of the keyboard. A clear, pure note rang out, cutting through the heavy silence. The sound seemed to startle her, and she pulled her hand back quickly as if she had been burned. She looked at her own finger, then at the piano, a fresh wave of tears welling in her eyes. "I had a piano," she said, her voice a little stronger now, but still thick with emotion. "It looked just like this, black and shiny, the most beautiful thing I had ever seen." The girl stared at her mother, her mind struggling to process this new information. Her mother had a piano? It was an impossible idea, like finding out her mother used to be an astronaut. Her mother's world was their small apartment, the bus stop, the hallways of other people's mansions. There was no room in that world for something as grand as a piano. "My mother worked for a rich family," her mother continued, her eyes still distant, lost in the past. "Not as a maid. She was a cook. They were good people. They had a daughter who was learning to play, but she didn't like it. So the teacher, who came twice a week, started teaching me instead. I would hide in the kitchen and listen, and one day he heard me tapping out a melody on the table. He said I had a gift." She paused, a sad, wistful smile touching her lips. "I practiced every day on their piano after the girl went to bed and the house was quiet. My hands were so fast back then, they could fly. I would close my eyes and it felt like I wasn't in a stuffy living room anymore. I was somewhere else, somewhere the music was the air and the sky." The girl listened, completely captivated. She was seeing a side of her mother she never knew existed, a young girl with a gift and a dream. It was like watching a black and white photograph slowly fill in with color. "My teacher, he said I was good enough. Good enough for the conservatory. He even talked about scholarships. He said I could be a real pianist, that I could play in front of people. For a while, I believed him. It was the only thing I ever wanted." Her mother's voice cracked on the last word, and she had to stop, taking a deep, shuddering breath. The girl's heart ached for her. She could see it so clearly, a young version of her mother. Her face full of hope, her fingers dancing across the keys, a world of music opening up before her. "But then my father got sick," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper again. "There was no money. Not for doctors, not for medicine. There was certainly no money for silly dreams. My mother needed help, so I left school. I found a job cleaning offices at night. I put the music away." She looked down at her hands again, clenching them into fists. "I promised myself I would go back to it one day. When things got better, but they never did. One day turned into a week turned into a year. The calluses on my fingers grew, and the softness you need for the keys disappeared. The music in my head got quieter and quieter, until one day, I realized I couldn't hear it anymore. It was gone." She finally looked at her daughter, and the girl saw a lifetime of pain and sacrifice in her eyes. "I asked you to play today because I saw you looking at it. I see the way you look at it, and I guess I wanted to hear it again. Just one more time. I wanted to see if the music was real, or if I had just imagined it all." The girl felt a hot sting behind her own eyes. Everything suddenly made sense. The strange look in her mother's eyes earlier, the desperate plea to hear her play. It wasn't a test. It was an invitation. Her mother hadn't just asked her to play a song. She had asked her to step into a time machine and bring back a piece of a lost life. The girl looked at her own hands, resting on the keys. They were smooth and unmarked. They were the hands of a beginner, of a child. But as she looked at them, she saw them differently. They were an extension of her mother's hands. The music she had played, the melody she had created, wasn't just hers. It belonged to her mother too. It was a continuation of a song that had been stopped decades ago. She understood now why her mother had cried. She wasn't crying because she was sad. She was crying because she was remembering. She was crying for the girl she used to be, for the dreams she had to sacrifice. And she was crying because, in hearing her daughter play, that dream was, for a few brief moments, alive again. The girl slowly slid off the piano bench and stood up. She walked around to where her mother was standing. The air between them was no longer filled with confusion and fear. It was thick with a new, profound understanding. She reached out and gently took one of her mother's work-worn hands in her own. She lifted it, and together, mother and daughter, they placed their hands on the cool, smooth surface of the piano. The girl's small, smooth hand on top of her mother's calloused, tired one. A past and a present, touching the same key, the same dream. The silence in the room was no longer empty or terrifying. It was filled with the echo of a song that had never truly been lost, just waiting for the right person to play it again. The touch of their hands on the cool, smooth wood of the piano was the only conversation they needed for a long moment. The girl's small, smooth hand rested gently on top of her mother's, a hand that had known a lifetime of hard work. In that touch, a century of time seemed to collapse. The past, with its stolen dreams and silent melodies, and the present, with its fragile, budding hope, were connected by the 88 keys that lay before them. The girl could feel the faint tremor in her mother's fingers, the vibration of a song that had been silent for decades. Slowly, her mother pulled her hand away, but she didn't step back. She looked at her daughter, and the tears in her eyes had changed. They were no longer just tears of sadness for a lost past. They were glistening with something new, something that looked like peace. A small, tired smile touched her lips, a real smile this time. One that reached her eyes and made them crinkle at the corners. "We should go," she said, her voice still soft but no longer fragile. It was the voice of the girl's mother again, solid and familiar. But now it held a new depth, a new resonance. The girl nodded, sliding her hand off the piano. As she stood up, she felt a change within herself. The world seemed sharper, more in focus. The colors of the fading light through the window were more vivid. The silence of the room was no longer empty, but filled with a story. She followed her mother out of the formal living room, but this time she didn't feel like an intruder. She felt like she was leaving a piece of herself behind, a promise to return. The walk through the mansion was different. Her mother didn't lead the way. They walked side by side. They passed the library, the grand staircase, the hallways filled with expensive art. The girl saw it all now through her mother's eyes. She imagined a younger version of her mother, a girl with a dream, walking these same halls, her heart full of music. This house was no longer just a symbol of wealth and a world she didn't belong to. It was a museum of her mother's youth. They stepped out into the cool evening air. The long driveway seemed shorter this time. The Rotterdam gates, which once felt like the entrance to a foreign land, now felt like a gateway they had crossed together. They walked to the bus stop in silence, but it wasn't the heavy, awkward silence of before. It was a comfortable, shared silence. The kind that exists between two people who understand each other, without needing to speak. The bus ride home was a journey through two different worlds. As the bus rumbled away from the manicured streets and pristine houses, the city began to change. The buildings grew closer together. The streets became noisier. The air grew thicker with the smells of exhaust fumes and street food. The girl looked out the window, watching the transition. She saw her own neighborhood not as a place of limitation, but as a place of reality. It was the world her mother had built for her, a world built on the foundation of a sacrificed dream. When they finally reached their small apartment, the girl felt a sense of relief. The familiar, cramped space felt more like a home than ever before. Her mother didn't collapse into her chair like she usually did. Instead, she went to the small kitchen and put on a kettle for tea. The girl sat at their small table, watching her mother's movements. They were the same movements she had seen 1,000 times, but now she saw the grace in them, the strength, the quiet resilience. Her mother brought 2 mugs of steaming tea to the table and sat down across from her. She wrapped her hands around her mug, her gaze thoughtful. "I don't want you to ever feel sorry for me," she said, breaking the silence. "I made my choices. I don't regret them. I have you. That's a better song than any I could have played on a piano." The girl felt a lump form in her throat. She just nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "But," her mother continued, her eyes meeting her daughter's, "seeing you play today, it was like a part of me that I thought was dead woke up. And it was happy. It was so happy to hear the music again." She paused, taking a sip of her tea. "That music is a gift, but it's a heavy one. It carries a lot of history. Do you understand?" The girl thought about her small plastic keyboard under her bed. It had always felt like an escape, a secret world that was just for her. But now she understood. It wasn't just hers. It was an inheritance. The melodies she created were built on the foundation of her mother's silent songs. "Yes," the girl whispered, the word barely audible. "I understand." Her mother reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. "Good, because I don't want that weight to crush you. I want it to lift you up. Every note you play, play it for both of us. Play it with all the joy you feel and all the joy I couldn't. Let it be your future, not my past." They sat there for a long time, the tea growing cold in their mugs. As the last of the daylight disappeared from the window, the girl asked her mother about the songs she used to play. Her mother, with a faraway look in her eyes, described them. She talked about fast, complicated pieces that made her fingers fly and slow, beautiful melodies that could make you cry. She couldn't remember all the names, but she remembered the feeling of playing them. The girl listened, committing every word to memory, cataloging the lost symphonies of her mother's youth. Later that night, after her mother had gone to bed, the girl did something she had never done before. She didn't wait for her mother to fall asleep. She went to her corner, pulled out the small yellowed keyboard, and plugged it in. She didn't put on her headphones. She sat on the edge of her mattress, her back to the curtain that separated her small space from the rest of the room. She could hear her mother's soft, steady breathing from the other side. She placed her fingers on the plastic keys, which felt flimsy and cheap now that she knew the touch of ivory. She closed her eyes, and she began to play. She didn't play the song from the mansion. She played a new one. It was a simple, gentle melody, a lullaby. It was a song of gratitude, a song of understanding, a song of a promise. As she played, the thin, tinny sound of the keyboard filled the small apartment. It was a quiet sound, a humble sound, but in the silence of the night, it was as powerful as a grand piano. She heard a soft rustle from the other room. Her mother had woken up, but she didn't come in. She just lay there in the dark, listening, and the girl knew she wasn't just hearing the clicking of plastic keys. She was hearing the music. She was hearing the echo of her own dream. Being given new life in the hands of her daughter, the girl played until her fingers were tired, her heart full of a feeling so big and complex she didn't have a name for it. It was a mix of sadness for her mother's past, joy for her own future, and a profound, overwhelming love. She finally stopped, her hands resting on the keys. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the ghost of the music, the quiet promise of all the songs yet to be played. She knew then that the music was no longer just her secret escape. It was her voice. It was her legacy. It was the heaviest, most beautiful gift her mother had ever given her, paid for with a lifetime of silent melodies. And as she sat there in the dark, she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, she would carry it for the rest of her life,